Good evening to everyone. My name is Jen Chambers. I am the Assistant Vice President of Lifelong Learning and Alumni Engagement and Development. Welcome to this evening's Forever Learning Institute session on the Bible as part of our Banned Books series. I am delighted to welcome our host for this evening's conversation, the brand new Dean of the Divinity School. He joined us in July of this year, Edgardo Colon-Emeric. Welcome, and you just returned from Rome, so it's nice to have you on the call after an extended trip abroad. Let me tell you a little bit about the dean. He is a double Dookie. He has both a Ph.D. and an MDiv from Duke. He also has a degree in mechanical engineering from both his master's and his undergraduate degrees. So a very diverse, interesting gentleman that we have joining our conversation this evening. He's originally from Puerto Rico, and as I said before, he joined the Divinity School as dean in 2021 this past summer. He is also the director for the Center for Reconciliation at Duke and has multiple different roles that he holds here at the university. And I am delighted to have him join this session with two of our fantastic faculty members talking about the Bible. So with that, I will turn it over to Edgardo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen, and good evening to all of you who are joining us for this second episode in the Forever Learning series on banned books. It might seem odd to have a series focus on the Bible as a banned book, given that it's the most published book in history. Nonetheless, it's a book that has a complex history of publication and experiences in censorship. So we'll have the time for conversation and reflection on these matters today. And joining me are wonderful colleagues from Duke University, Brent Strawn, the D. Moody Smith Distinguished Professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School, and Jennifer Knust, Professor of Religious Studies at Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. And I will turn it over first to Brent Strawn to lead us into our topic.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Edgardo. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here for this event. I'm going to share my screen briefly here to begin with a slide and a quotation that I'd like to begin with from the great literary critic George Steiner. This is from his book, Languages and Silence, Essays on Language, Literature, and the Inhuman. In that great discourse with the living dead, which we call reading, our role is not a passive one, where it is more than reverie or an indifferent appetite sprung of boredom. Reading is a mode of action. We engage the presence, the voice of the book. We allow it entry, though not unguarded, into our inmost. A great poem, a classic novel press in upon us. They assail and occupy the strong places of our consciousness. They exercise upon our imagination and desires, upon our ambitions and most covert dreams, a strange, bruising mastery. Men who burn books know what they are doing. That's a stunning quotation, especially that last bit, and I was reminded of it when I thought about tonight's event and the topic before us. Steiner was born in 1929 of Jewish heritage, and in his writing, he seems to never have the Holocaust or Nazi Germany far from his mind. And so it's easy to imagine that the Nazi book burning campaigns of the 1930s lurk behind his comment here. But as this Duke Continuing Education event has already shown in the first episode and will continue to show, book banning and book burning wasn't the creation of the Nazis. So to turn directly to the topic of tonight's session, I thought it might be interesting first to begin with two images of book burning that come from the Bible itself. The first comes from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19. Which recounts a number of people in the city of Ephesus joining the nascent Christian community. Here is the pertinent passage in the New Revised Standard Version. Also, many of those who became believers confessed and disclosed their practices. A number of those who practiced magic collected their books and burned them publicly. When the value of these books was calculated, it was found to come to 50,000 silver coins. So the word of the Lord grew mightily and prevailed. Again, Acts 19:18-20. Now, I should say I'm not an expert in the New Testament or early Christianity. Indeed, many would deem that to be far above my pay grade. So I'm happy to defer to my esteemed colleague, Professor Jenny Knust, on this passage. She may discuss it, but may not. In any event, I'm just going to throw it out there as a first pitch. If she wants to swing at it, she can. I will say here, though, only that this passage suggests that in Ephesus, religiosity led to a renunciation of a former way of life, and that in this text, that renunciation is physically represented by the burning of books. The people who did this there in Ephesus, presumably, also knew what they were doing when they did that, to quote Steiner again. But it's important to note that this passage from the book of Acts presents this as a voluntary act on the part of those so moved. This was no top-down requirement or a sanctioned activity required by the apostles, in marked contrast to the book burnings in Germany in the 1930s. The second image of book burning that I want to mention is from the biblical text. Is quite different, though, than Acts 19 on this score, and it comes from my primary area of expertise, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. In Jeremiah 36, the prophet Jeremiah dictates a scroll to his scribe, Baruch, which contains a message from God to Judah to turn from its evil ways and receive divine forgiveness. So not a bad content in this scroll. Baruch is then sent by Jeremiah to the temple because Jeremiah is prohibited from entering at this particular time. So Baruch is said to have read the scroll in the temple. And when some very important people heard the scroll, they immediately worried and they relayed it up the chain until it reached finally the sitting king, King Jehoiakim. As the scroll was read out in the king's presence, column by column, Jehoiakim is said to have cut 3 or 4 columns off at a time with a penknife and thrown them into the fire blazing in his winter apartment until, the text says, the entire scroll was consumed. Here's an engraving from David Martin's that depicts this event of King Jehoiakim burning the scroll. So this second image of book burning or scroll burning is a case of top-down burning, scroll burning in this case, that is clearly presented as wrong, even evil according to Jeremiah 36, especially given the benevolent message of this scroll. The king, as it were, is preventing the people of Judah from hearing this benevolent message from God through the prophet Jeremiah. Now, as you might imagine, this didn't sit very well with the prophet Jeremiah or the God that he served. So right after this scroll book burning took place, the text says that God sent another message, this one quite pointed and quite brutal about the king directly, even against the king's own person. This second message is not nearly so benevolent, quite to the contrary. Then the text says that Jeremiah took another scroll and gave it to the secretary Baruch, son of Neriah, who wrote on it at Jeremiah's dictation all the words of the scroll that King Jehoiakim of Judah had burned in the fire. Take that, Jehoiakim. He just gets a repetition of the entire scroll. It's just let's do it again, Baruch, from the top, start again, and we'll do it all over again. But the text isn't done. There's one more poignant line in this verse, and many similar words were added to them. In other words, you can't stop this scroll. And if you try to censor it, you'll just get it again, and then yet still more of the same. This second text in this encounter with Jehoiakim in the scroll of Jeremiah, looked at from a slightly different angle, might suggest that more of the same, more text, might be able to counteract the problem of banning or censoring or burning some text. More of the text might prevent that problem or counteract that problem of banning, censoring, or burning some. That brings me to another example of Bible banning that I'd like to discuss with the limited time I have left. Let me say first that apart from Jeremiah 36, I know of no examples of the Bible or parts of the Bible being banned at least in the periods I study, which mostly predate the finalization of the Bible as such. That's sort of makes sense, right? Since the periods I work in precede the Bible's final formulation as Bible, they're naturally going to be slim on evidence of banning the Bible, Jeremiah 36 notwithstanding, because there isn't yet a finalized Bible to ban. That point granted, not long into the early centuries of the Common Era, we encounter a famous, or rather infamous, figure who disliked a great swath of the Bible, especially the part I study, the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. His name was Marcion. Marcion died around 160 CE. So his dates indicate that this voice of his comes rather early in the post-biblical period. I'm again poaching on my colleagues' territory. I'm very painfully aware of that. And also I'm aware that I'm painting with a bit of a broad brush at this point. But with those caveats entered, for present purposes, the important point to lift up is that Marcion effectively wanted to ban the Old Testament from Christian faith and practice. He found the presentation of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament irreconcilable. He collated these data as he saw them in a book called The Antitheses, and the title of that book says it all. You know, the Old Testament says this, but the New Testament says this. The God of the Old Testament was, in Marcion's view, a wicked demigod. The God revealed by Jesus in the New Testament was utterly different and new, so that a famous biography of Marcion is subtitled The Gospel of the Alien God. Alien because Jesus introduced this God for the first time. Marcion thus effectively banned the Old Testament. To use language from a more recent megachurch pastor from Atlanta, where I used to live prior to my coming to Duke, Marcion sought to unhitch Christian faith from the Hebrew Bible. It's not hard to imagine and even to witness the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic ramifications of such a move. Maybe the 1930s book burnings aren't so distant after all. In fact, I think they aren't very distant at all. But to return to Jeremiah 36, you can't stop the scroll. And more text might actually help counteract the problem of banning, censoring, or burning some of the text, including Marcion's problems on this front. This was, in fact, the considered opinion of the heresiologists, the people who combated ancient heresies as then defined in the ancient world, like Tertullian, who was born about the same time that Marcion died. Tertullian wrote no less than 5 books against Marcion, in which he argued that Marcion's Bible banning resulted in serious problems for him and all who followed him. Important points of belief and practice were lost because Marcion metaphorically burned the Old Testament. Tertullian's own remedy was to show how wrong Marcion was on the basis of the Old Testament itself. After that, he went on to show how wrong Marcion was on the basis of the New Testament. And by the end, in books 4 and 5, Tertullian is just showing off, using just the materials that Marcion liked and validated to, again, yes, show just how wrong Marcion was. So in brief, more text via Tertullian, better knowledge of it and dexterity in it showed what was so wrong about Marcion's banning, which left the Bible a shadow of its former self with all sorts of problems lurking as a direct result. I think in sum, we could say that Tertullian and Jeremiah would have gotten along just fine. Well, my time is up, so I must sadly stop there, but it's my delight to pass things over to my colleague who is sure to enlighten us and hopefully correct any egregious errors I may have made. So Jenny, please take it away.
Well, Brent, I hate to disappoint you. You didn't make any mistakes, so I can't disabuse you of any errors that you made. But let me go ahead and share my screen too, and I'll get started. And then I hope during our conversation we could talk some more about Marcion and then and Tertullian and all the material that you just introduced for us. So thank you. So first of all, I just really want to thank Jen Chambers and Joe Supernaw for inviting me to come and be part of this really awesome conversation and series, which is so exciting and what a cool topic and pertinent for right now. And I also want to thank Andy Scott and Rashana Enoch for making sure that we don't mess anything up, because you don't want to ask, particularly me, to be doing anything technological. So it's really helpful that you're here helping with that. So thank you. And also to the dean and to my colleague, Brent. I'm so grateful to both of you, and also Brent for being in conversation with me in advance of this about what we might present. So that's been really helpful and fruitful, and I hope makes a better presentation for everyone here. And then, of course, finally, I want to thank the audience. I'm so grateful to be here at Duke, and I'm really glad to welcome so many Duke alumni and friends here. It's such a privilege to be at this amazing institution, and I really do thank my lucky stars and count my blessings every day that I get to be in conversation with so many people in the Duke community. So thank you. Okay, so for my remarks, given my own current projects, what I've decided to do is focus not on banned books per se, but on New Testament traditions that, thanks to some combination of the Renaissance, the invention of the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, and the European Enlightenment, ended up being relegated to the status of not really in the text. Yeah. So if the text isn't really there, should it be banned? Is it canon? Is it still authoritative in some way? These are some questions that I'm hoping that you all will think about with me tonight. So these questions around what's in and out of the text continue to circulate around the Protestant New Testament in fascinating ways, highlighting the ways that books convey shifting literary, historical, and conceptual categories, as well as strings of words recognized as a given work. Written out by hand for over a millennium, passed from person to person, and employed in many ways, New Testament manuscripts and copies preserve traces of assumptions, priorities, and interests of those who produce and preserve them. So every New Testament, including Marcion's, transmits both a text and a record of human activity, including the print and digital editions that we employ today. The survival of the New Testament as a text and a collection, I tell my students, is a theological and practical achievement that is repeatedly refreshed in response to new circumstances, even as remains of past approaches continue to shape what can happen next. So with that said, let's get started with the talk in earnest. Okay. So in 1831, the German classical philologist Karl Lachmann published a New Testament that had been a long time in coming. For 3 centuries, the Protestants of Europe had read, translated, and revered a text first printed in 1531 by the humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam. This text served as a basis for Martin Luther's New Testament, the authorized King James Version translation, and several other important Protestant vernacular testaments, including and ultimately settling in as the Protestant quote unquote text received by all, or Textus Receptus. And what you see here on the right-hand side in the image is actually an image of Robert Estienne or Stephanus's 1551 edition that we hold in the Rubenstein Library at Duke, and anyone is eligible to go see it. So I recommend you go see it. See, that's me seeing it. You see my hand on it? It's really tiny. And I was really surprised by how small it is, considering what a huge impact it had, right? So it's like this little tiny book, and then like, boom, it really took off and had a tremendous impact. But the interesting thing about the Textus Receptus is that it's based on Greek texts found in Europe, Western Europe at the time, and especially in Basel, because that's where Erasmus was when he was preparing his own New Testament. And pretty soon after the Textus Receptus, or this particular text, was published, it became clear to Protestant scholars that the complexity of the Greek tradition is every bit as difficult and thorny as the complexity of the Latin tradition, which was the tradition they were reacting against. And indeed, as of today, we know that there are over 5,000 manuscript copies of the New Testament, none of which are identical in every particular. So we have a problem of textual divergence that is not easy to resolve, especially since, in theory at least, many Protestants refuse to employ tradition as an arbiter of what the text is or should be. In the 19th century, this dilemma led to fierce controversies about what the New Testament can and should contain. And I'm just going to show you a few examples so you can get the idea. Most, but by no means all, copies of the Gospel of Mark contain a set of verses scholars refer to the longer ending. And I put it up here not so that you'll take the time to read the longer ending, but to show you how long it is. It's long. Late ancient and medieval Christians were also aware of this textual problem, interestingly. So here's a reference to the problem from the 4th century in a text that may be by the famous historian Eusebius of Caesarea, where Eusebius, or someone writing in his name, argues that the double reading, that is, those manuscripts that contain the longer ending and those don't, can both be accepted so long as faithful and pious Christians also accept it. In other words, from this point of view, as long as Christians who this writer regards as also fellow Christians are reading this text is fine, and we can read the shorter one or the longer one, and we don't mind. So the longer ending is interesting and important for Christian tradition, in part because of the tradition about Mary Magdalene and the 7 demons, which you can also find in the Gospel of Luke, the instructions to go and proclaim the good news to the whole creation, or all the world, which is a version of what we know as the Great Commission from the Gospel of Matthew. And also these really interesting stories about how those who believe in Jesus are capable of handling snakes and drinking poison, which would go on to have a tremendously important history, particularly in the United States of America, interestingly enough. So for 3 centuries, Protestants are reading this longer ending as part of the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because Martin Luther is reading it as part of the Gospel of Mark. Here you can see the longer ending printed in Martin Luther's September Testament, because here in the authorized or King James Version of 1611, you can also see this is the text, the English translation of Mark 16:8-10 as found in King James Version. And there are many other examples. So as far as everybody knows, for 3 centuries, who are, anybody who's Protestant, who's reading vernacular translations, this is in the text. Over time, however, what the Greek tradition already knew became equally evident to Protestant scholars like Theodore Beza, who was a biblical scholar and heir to John Calvin in Geneva, John Mill, who was an English theologian and Oxford professor who was responsible for a massive edition in 1707 that really disturbed everyone, because according to popular imagination, Mill found 30,000 textual variations in the New Testament. And also Johann Jakob Wettstein, who is a German scholar responsible for a 1751 edition that you're seeing here in this slide. The longer ending of Mark and other beloved passages were not present in every Greek manuscript copy, and this had become clear. Here in Wettstein's 1751 edition, which these are my pictures from Duke. So again, go to Duke and you can see this. It's so cool. You can actually see Wettstein's 1751 edition with the Textus Receptus printed there at the top of the line, and then below, all of his notes below, sort of showing all of the problems that he found when he was looking at textual divergence. And this particular passage that Wettstein is discussing is actually not the longer ending, but another famous passage you may have heard of, which is the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery from John chapter 7, verse 53 to 8:11. This story does not appear in many copies, especially the copies that in the 18th and 19th century scholars came to revere, like Codex Sinaiticus, imaged here from the Codex Sinaiticus project. I encourage you to check that out online. You can read the whole thing. Oh my gosh, my parents, sorry, that's their, I'm in Maine. Hi, my Maine Duke friends. My dad had surgery and that is their clock. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, back to Codex Sinaiticus, which I encourage you to go look at. You can actually go see this and look at that. The story of the woman in adultery is not there. So once this had started to be noticed and Karl Lachmann made that bold decision not to print the Textus Receptus, you can see what happens to some of these famous stories. And I've just given you famous ones because you might know them. So for example, the longer ending in Mark, we've been discussing the tradition of the bloody sweat in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is sweating at the Garden of Gethsemane, drops of blood, or the angel at Bethesda who in the pool, who disturbs the pool, or the story of the woman taken in adultery. And as you can see, these critical scholars are making all kinds of decisions to omit, to print, or what now is the custom to print in brackets these passages that Protestant scholars came to see as not part of the original text or the authorial text that the gospel writers and Paul or other writers composed at the time. So How did this happen? I mean, not every Protestant scholar was thrilled about this. Here's my favorite example from Dean Burgon, who was an Anglican dean, who was not at all happy about these new scientific developments in the study of text, and promised the faithful that soon it would only be a matter of time until the traditional text, that is the Protestant Textus Receptus, and the vernacular translations that are based on it would ultimately be vindicated. Now, Burgon's prediction did not come true, as those of us who read translations like the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, or the New International Version might be aware if you're paying attention and you're looking at the brackets in your translation. While it's the case that the Authorized or King James Version continues to incorporate these passages, that's because it's based on the Textus Receptus or something like it. Many other Protestant vernacular translations do not. But why? How has it been possible to omit these passages? Well, I think a quick answer to the question can be, well, it has something to do with a combination of the Protestant Reformation and the introduction of science as part of the European Enlightenment. Here's an example of Johannes Gerhard arguing in this is not 1863. Sorry, I should have put the original date here. We're looking at the 16th century argument by the very important heir to Luther and Lutheran theologian, making the point that Scripture alone should arbitrate what the church's tradition ought to be, and we shouldn't rely on the church to tell us what we should be reading. So if that's the case, what should we be reading? The answer comes from textual criticism as developed in the European Enlightenment. Here on the slide, you can see a discussion of what that ought to look like in Westcott and Hort. It's very important, the New Testament in the original Greek, which especially in the English-speaking world had a huge impact and was actually the cause of Dean Burgon's anger. Westcott and Hort say, progress consists not in the growing perfection of an ideal in the future, but in approximation towards complete ascertainment of definite facts of the past, that is, toward recovering an exact copy of what was actually written on parchment and papyrus by the author of the book or his amanuensis, that is, his scribe to whom he would have been dictating. This approach, this idea that we should return to the documents and use scientifically established principles that we find on the basis of reason in order to develop a text that we then return to the church became the way in which Protestant scholars dealt with problems like the longer ending and so on. So this led to a sea change in textual editing, with textual changes informed by scientific advances. European scientists' racial categories, for example, informed the pursuit of genealogical relationships or family ties among texts. You're seeing Gunter Zundt's example from 1953, where he's trying to figure out, you can see he's got the originals and the earliest copies working their way down textual streams from the West, where the Vulgate translations, through the East, through what he calls text types, Egypt, in Caesarea, and in the Byzantine text, where he, from Zundt's perspective, has the idea that texts have complexions or racial categories that can help us figure out how to understand them. Now, the word science, in this case, racialized genealogical science, is going to solve our problem of what's really in the text. More recently, we can see a very different method, although related to this older method, called stemmatology, in which the current editors of the Editio Critica Major, these are wonderful scholars in Münster, Germany, who are using these methods and updating them in order to figure out what's in the text. And they're doing so through stemmatology and something they call the coherence-based genealogical method, which I will not try to explain right now. From the perspective of these scholars who are devoted to science, attempts to figure out what's in the text must be scientifically rather than traditionally determined, if that makes sense. And what that's led to is actually a constantly changing text. Here's a really interesting example from Mark 1:1. At the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the writer says, in the beginning, or at the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. The question is the title Son of God there? That's Christou huiou theou or Christou huiou tu theou. And you can see just from this list that title, Son of God, has come in and out of the critically edited New Testament for a long time. Should Son of God be there? Should the longer ending be there? Should other of these unstable texts be there? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. Maybe you do. But I do want to show you that there are other options. For example, here's a medieval manuscript from Paris, and look what this editor did. Instead of taking texts away, what this editor has done is in fact included both of them. So some manuscripts in the Gospel of Luke say that the disciples after Jesus's resurrection were in the temple blessing God. Others say they were in the temple praising God. Some editor along the way decided, well, they're doing both. They're blessing and praising God. So this editor has used this inclusive way of thinking about what's in the text. Or here's another example from Duke, and you can go see this manuscript, where an editor has added the words of Theophylact, a Bulgarian bishop, and he's added them, in this case, in the margin, as a way of including Theophylact's readings in what he had in front of him. So in other words, there's different ways to think about tradition than what has come down to, in the context of New Testament textual criticism. So I'm going to stop my share so I can say my final words. That's a nice picture of Mary Magdalene, but we'll let her go away. Okay, so here's my final point. The Paris and Duke manuscripts, I would argue, aren't necessarily better or worse than modern editions from which many of us now read the New Testament, whether in Greek or in English, but they can perhaps remind us, I think, of a larger principle, which is that interpretation, the concept of what a work should be, cannot actually be separated from criticism, the art of keeping a work alive, but in fact, relegating the longer ending of Mark to a set of brackets has not eliminated it from consideration, but instead put these verses to another use. Thank you very much. And now I'm so happy to turn this conversation back over to Edgardo and Brent, and hopefully we can widen the circle and have a conversation together. Thanks.
Thank you to both to Brent and to Jenny for these wonderful, I think, complementary presentations. And perhaps I'll start with a question for either of you to address. One of the things I was interested in as I was hearing you talk was also the role of translations, different translations, and thinking of wondering what impact the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, how that was received or not in different Jewish communities, and the impact of that also on the Greek version of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible on and the lists for which books are considered by Christians to be part of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So it's like what books are included or not. I mean, you're both kind of touching on these matters, not banning so much, but what is brought in, and so and languages, the role that languages play in this too.
Do you want to? You're the expert on the Old Testament part. I mean, I think I didn't talk about that because I knew Brent would be here to fill us in. But I mean, one of the other things that happens in the Protestant Reformation is that there's the turn to the Hebrew and Greek, and you saw that in the Gerhard quote that I didn't read fully, but that the idea of the Protestants was that if it wasn't in the Hebrew, it's not actually in the Old Testament, which then led to the demotion to the category apocrypha of many texts, because prior to the Protestant Reformation, Christians in both the Greek-speaking East and in the Latin-speaking West were actually reading the Septuagint as the Old Testament, not the Hebrew. It was a combination of the Renaissance humanist back to the sources and the Protestant preference for the Hebrew, and the critique of the Vulgate's translation of the Greek that actually provoked the kind of textual criticism that then led Protestants in the 19th century to discover that their Greek text was even worse shaped than their Hebrew, if that's possible. So that's like, they back themselves into this kind of corner, but they start out by rejecting the Septuagint. Yeah, Brent, you want to say more about that?
No, that's right. That sounds just right to me. I don't have much to add, only that this sort of criterion that was used that in the Reformation period, that if it wasn't in Hebrew, it shouldn't be included. And these so-called deuterocanonical or apocryphal books existed only in Greek. Turns out that's not true. It turns out that once the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we discovered there were Hebrew originals of some of those books preserved at Qumran among the other scrolls found at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Tobit particularly and Sirach have Semitic originals, and so presumably were originally written in a Hebrew or in some cases Aramaic, and so that Greek criterion doesn't really stand up. But you could really see the Protestant move away from the Apocrypha as a kind of book banning, a Bible banning. I mean, within, Jenny, you could correct me, but I think really within a generation, there's really no more Protestant work done, preaching, writing, commenting on the Apocrypha anymore, because now it's not really canonical anymore for that movement as it was for the Church Universal up to that point.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing, because I work on early Christianity also, like that's my thing I'm supposed to be actually doing. And I just got stuck on Protestants for some other reason. And my favorite example of this is my favorite early Christian scholar, Origen of Alexandria, already has this problem that he's addressing in the 3rd century, where a very learned colleague of his by the name of Julius Alexander is saying to him, or Africanus, sorry, Julius Africanus is saying, "Oh, Origen, why are you reading Susanna in the book of Daniel? Don't you know there's no Hebrew copy of that?" And Origen's like, "Yeah, but that's just wrong because the church reads it." He has the same criteria as Eusebius, right? So he's like, of course, Susanna's really in the Old Testament. It's really in Daniel, and then offers a defense. But then along comes the Protestant Reformation, and guess what happens to Susanna? Out goes Susanna. But meanwhile, in Europe, if you go walk, I dare you to walk into a church and not find some image of Susanna. Like she was a really important figure, and that was a really important story prior to the Reformation.
And maybe one more footnote to add to this, because Edgardo brought this aspect up, is I think that it is intriguing to note that the Septuagint seems to have been kind of co-opted pretty quickly, the Greek translation pretty quickly by Christians. And that was a point of concern for some Jews. And so the revisers, the so-called 3 revisers of the Septuagint, Aquila, Theodotion, and Symmachus, they do their own translations of the Greek, and it does seem to be that they move back towards the Hebrew a little more closely than the Septuagint, hew a little more closely to the Hebrew. So that might suggest that, kind of as you were asking, Edgardo, a kind of level of discomfort about the way some of these translations were taken over and quickly adopted.
Thank you. And I noticed that we're still getting questions from people in the audience, and I'll turn to those in a moment. But perhaps one more question from you. Maybe you have questions for each other too, and I want to make room for those too. But I was really struck by your comment on how, Jenny, on how the Protestants were led to looking for textual criticism that would be guided by science rather than tradition. And we heard the kind of the Protestant side of the story. Any insights on the Catholic side of the story? Because they were facing the same questions in the text, and these were, as you noticed, well known. From long time before these questions. So how were those addressed by the Catholics?
So I'm going to answer over my parents' grandfather clock, for which I apologize. But so yes, the Catholics were absolutely concerned about this. And in fact, the Catholics beat Erasmus by 2 years in terms of developing, like a scientific, or at least a critical or a some kind of edition of the Bible that would allow them to compare and make decisions about the Vulgate's fidelity to what was debated to be the authoritative text, and that's called the Complutensian Polyglot, which again, we have a copy at Duke, so you should just all go see it immediately, because I went to go see it, and it is a thing of beauty. I mean, it was produced in Spain in 1514 and then actually published in 1520 after the Pope agreed with, that it was an excellent product. And this is a Catholic attempt to sort of be attentive to what was in the Greek and what was in the Vulgate and to compare. So it's not that the Catholics weren't aware that there were differences between the Vulgate and some of the Greek texts, or many of the Greek texts that were available in Europe. I mean, it's a long story, and actually, Edgardo, you might be better at telling us about that story. But as I understand it, there's the Council of Trent, and there's a big discussion about whether we're going to affirm the Vulgate as the sacred text of the Catholic Church, and ultimately it is affirmed. But that doesn't mean that Catholics don't understand what they're affirming. It's not that different from back in my period, with my favorite hero, Origen of Alexandria, trying to figure out how to defend the Septuagint. So what does he do? He makes this huge edition of the Septuagint called the Hexapla that has the Hebrew text, the Septuagint text, Aquila, Theodoton, and Symmachus, and the Hebrew transliterated, all in order to show that the Septuagint really can be the sacred text, So the Catholics kind of go in that direction, and the Protestants go in a different direction, but I'm not sure that how much that has to do with, one text is better than another. It really has to do with, in my reading anyway, the way that these texts get pulled into political as well as theological controversies, and that the debates about a single passage or a book become emblematic of a political positioning that is being taken by a given Protestant or Catholic. So that would be my read as a religious studies scholar of what happened there.
Thank you. One question that is on the chat concerns, it's addressed to you, Jenny, but I think, Brent, you could answer it as well. Any books that would be good introductions to the origin and interpretations of the Bible over history, and something that would be accessible, accurate, engaging, and the like, not too heavy.
I think there's a great book by, I'm going to put it in the chat. His name is Christopher de Hamel. Of course, I can never remember the names of books that I especially like, but I think you'll be able to find it pretty easily. And it's kind of an introduction to the whole problem. And it's written from a Christian side, so it's not giving that like a Jewish perspective, which would also be really helpful. And you can find a Jewish perspective on this by a scholar at Harvard by the name of David Stern. That's a really good book. And then there's a really great book on Protestant Bibles and the impact of humanism and the Protestant Reformation by Jaroslav Pelikan, who is a really eminent historian and scholar from Yale from back in the day. So anyway, I recommend those.
Yeah, and I just put a little one,
Oh, yeah,
which is the Bible, a very short introduction, which is these nice little volumes.
Yeah, that's a great one.
With bibliography. All these will give you further bibliography to keep yourself up late at night or put you to sleep quickly, depending on how you how these things reach you. But anyway.
Thank you. Someone in the chat mentioned how putting the vernacular in the hands of laity was controversial, and talking about burning of translators as well as of books. And any reflections regarding the history of translation, and particularly as translation intersected with politics and led to violence as well, and banning of people as well.
Well, since we're talking about bibliography, there's a really great book by Jonathan Sheehan called The Enlightenment Bible. And one of his main points is that because the vernacular Bible became so crucial to Protestant identity, and, in part because Protestants, were persecuted, I'm not, that's part of it. It's like, in certain contexts, they were persecuted as they persecuted Catholics in other contexts. So, there was a lot of blood spilled over these Bibles. on every side, the 30 Years' War. We could just keep talking about that. But one of his points is that because the vernacular Bibles became so crucial to Protestant identity, and because they're based on Erasmus ultimately, and because that text is probably not a great text if you're rejecting the idea of tradition. It's a great text if you uphold the idea of like Greek Orthodox tradition is what we want to be reading, that Textus Receptus is fine. But if what you want to be reading is the text that's, the autograph or something, as that comes to be understood in the Protestant world, it's not a great text. But Protestants didn't want to give it up because they were reading vernacular translations based on that Greek text. Yeah. So you can see Dean Burgon being really upset and angry that the Textus Receptus was being overthrown because it was the basis of Protestant practice. So there's like a, later what happens next kind of moment. But in terms of Martin Luther and all of the vernacular translations and the upset that caused throughout Europe, gosh, that's a serious, I don't even know where to begin on that one.
That's well said. I was thinking in part, the story is a sordid one of people controlling access or wanting to control access and denying access to things that other people think everyone should have access to, and again, it's not unlike Jeremiah 36 with King Jehoiakim shutting down the scroll, or another great text in this regard is Amos 7, where the prophet Amos has a showdown with the high priest of Bethel, who doesn't want Amos to prophesy anymore. And it's a test case and text case in who sort of has the authority. Is it the priestly aristocracy, or is it this sort of prophet from across the border from Judah in the south who's bringing word on behalf of the oppressed poor? Amos is this articulate prophet of judgment. And as I think about some of these other examples, there's just a bunch of them that are truly disturbing and grave. I mean, one that is maybe slightly less grave, and Edgardo could instruct us on this too, but it's of some interest in light of the Methodist heritage of Duke and the continuing Methodist affiliation of the Divinity School at Duke, is the John Wesley, when he came over to the States, edited a version of the prayer book for use in the States, and severely edited the Psalms, and took a lot of the Psalms out that have to do with enemies and with particularly strong words against the enemies. And one can kind of sense, or maybe if in a generous mode, think that Wesley was trying to, I don't know, do something good, sanctify things or something, or maybe he had the best intentions. We want to give the benefit of the doubt. But in removing that sort of material from the life of the average Bible reader, he's effectively censoring things that the book of Psalms wants its readers to have. And that, in fact, I think a good argument could be made that even those very brutal Psalms that say brutal things about the enemies can actually be seen in a very helpful therapeutic light. It's a way to sort of come clean with feelings, or articulate grief and sorrow, that if you kind of take that away, you're actually shortchanging the reader of the Psalms. And so, even I think in a generous construal of Wesley trying to do something right, it's actually sort of done something quite wrong in that sort of banning or censoring parts of the Psalter. I may have that wrong, though, Edgardo. You should enlighten us if I have that wrong.
Well, it would be an interesting conversation to look at that would be a lecture session on its own, and kind of editing work that Wesley engages in with the 30 Articles of Religion of the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, and other aspects of his tradition. But it does show that there's this impulse, perhaps it's something that the two of you could reflect on too, that is present also in the tradition of the scribes, of the writing down of texts, and in wanting to help the readers of the texts would perhaps sometimes understand confusing portions, ways in which they then perhaps add to or take away from the text. I mean, I'm hearing you, we're talking about banned verses, in some cases banned books or sections of books, but then also banning in some cases of translations, and banning of the book as a whole. And all these different kind of levels intersect at different historical periods.
I think there's also a case of benign neglect or maybe malign neglect, that sometimes things fall out of use. They're effectively banned just by the fact that they're not used or not read. And I think there's a lot to be said in the history of religious reading of the Bible that suggests this much, kind of the waxing and waning of certain parts of the Bible that are important at certain parts of certain times in the history of the world, and drop out at other times. And that's kind of an interesting way that it still sort of stays in the book. It's not banned, but it's sort of effectively, its use is attenuated.
I wonder though what you think, Brent, about because it occurred to me as I was preparing this talk that sometimes when these passages that are, well, they're not necessarily banned, but they're relegated, right? So they're no longer considered part of the tradition in the same way. So now we don't think that the story of the woman taken in adultery was written by the evangelist John. So should we therefore use it in liturgy? Should we read it the same way? With that story, everyone reads it anyway because everyone likes it. But there are other passages where people just don't care.
Right.
But sometimes what happens when you ban something or relegate it, it all of a sudden becomes much more interesting, right? So then it actually raises the profile of something
the lost books
nobody
of the Bible.
cared about. Exactly. Like now, because it becomes a controversial point now.
That's right.
And so if what we're doing is saying, oh, well, we don't read the longer of ending of Mark anymore, Dean Bergeon, like that's just, you just have to give that up if you're going to actually be a proper Protestant who follows the, rule of reason in terms of how I'm just imagining this imaginary conversation with him and give it up, dude. Like, and him being like, no, I'm not going to, we love this passage. That controversy is a way of getting people to declare sides about what they're for. And so then the text has a different kind of use. It stops being about whatever it's about, right? And it becomes instead a way of declaring sides around, in this case, whether we're Protestants who like textual criticism or whether we're not,
Yeah. Well, here's a question back to you, since both of us worked on the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. And I also was on the editorial board for the Common English Bible. It seems to me that translation boards have the chance to make decisions about some of these things. Like, they could decide not to print the longer ending period. I mean, or put it in a footnote or not include it at all. That's within the power of an editorial board, I suppose, at least. But I don't know of any editorial boards that have had the guts to sort of do that, right? I mean, because of the weightiness of the tradition, its position, or its presence in at least some manuscripts. I don't know. I wondered what your take was on that.
Well, I mean, it's a really good point that it's not especially with something like the Bible, it's not easy to change it, right? Like you can't just make a decision. Oh, I'm going to throw out the longer ending, or I'm going to keep it in, or I'm going to take the brackets on, or I'm going to take them off, like this. Right. And having been on the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition board, I mean, there were some things I wish we could have changed that we did not change because it's not up to me. It's up to the board. It's up to the National Council of Churches. We, as a body, we made decisions. And so it's not, or Jennifer, I go by Jenny. It's not Jenny's decision about what she likes, right? It's actually what we operating out of a tradition. And I think this is what point I want to make to us as Protestants, those of us who are Protestant, we operate within a tradition, right? So that we may deny, the tradition of the tradition is to deny that there's a tradition. But what I want to say is there's a tradition, and that tradition has a long, complicated history. Yeah. And so when things are bracketed, it's not an accident.
Yeah.
Well, to bring this to a close, I mean, we could really go on for much longer, but perhaps one last thing for me is that question for me is I'm intrigued by this comment about men who burn books know what they're doing that you mentioned, Brent. And in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, just to pick example of Guatemala, just having a Bible, particularly the Latin American version of the Bible, so it's called, which is translation, was seen as was very dangerous. Was seen because it identified you as subversive, as allied with communists, and so people would hide it, because if they were found with the Bible, they would be arrested or worse. And what were those people? Say they know what they were doing. What were they doing? What is your sense of what's going on with those kinds of the kind of violent reaction to having a Bible or a certain version or translation of the Bible that led to violence? And Jenny, you mentioned 30 Years' War, for example.
Well, perhaps I could answer that question by thinking about a period that I really actually kind of know better, which is the late antiquity, and talk about one of the reasons why maybe our texts are a mess is because Diocletian burned Bibles. Yeah. So one of the things that the Emperor Diocletian did was collect Christian books and destroy them. So that means that all of those texts are lost, right? And so what comes into the 4th century and into the period of Constantine and after is different than what might have been before. And I think that was because Christians had declared themselves a bookish people. And so if you want to get them where they live, you burn their books. So books become emblematic of a group's identity, and that gets repeated in various ways. I'm so struck by this example of Guatemala. I don't know if you know this book, Paper Cadavers. You probably do. This is your expertise and not mine, but that's such a moving book about the way in which in Guatemala, texts provided documentation of what might otherwise have been lost. And even when people burn texts, it strikes me that people and books have a miraculous capacity to survive to another day and to somehow live. And you never know where a resurrected book or person's going to end up, seems to me.
I'll just add that, I think that, we're probably all familiar with texts that disturb us or trouble us in the Bible, but it's also the case that the Bible has inspired remarkable works of great human courage and generosity and compassion. And I think that the example you've lifted up, Edgardo, is a kind of example of how many don't want that kind of compassion and generosity shown. I mean, it's Jose Miranda who wrote the Book of Psalms can be seen as nothing more than the struggle of the just against the unjust. So if you are trying to keep people down, you do not want them to have a copy of the Psalms, because the Psalms is going to inspire them in their struggle against the unjust. It's going to give them hope against the unjust. And I think one of the examples of censorship or selective censorship that is really that I've only recently looked at more closely is the 1807 Bible that was produced for the conversion of slaves in the British Empire. And the amount of material that's left out of that Bible is stunning. Everything that would actually, counter and refute slavery. Of course, all that's left out, right? And there's a wonderful line from a formerly enslaved person named, her name is kind of come to me. It's written in Lisa Bowen's book, The African American Readings of Paul. Jenny Proctor is her name. And she said, we believed everything our slave masters were telling us because we had no way of finding out different. We didn't see any Bibles, But with the way Lisa Bowen describes this, if there's other Bibles, if there's other texts, more texts, there's a way to find things out different. And I suspect that's why these groups that you're describing, and they've been with us for centuries, and their name is Legion, want to keep that scripture out of the hands of people who might otherwise benefit from reading it and living differently because of it.
Well, thank you both. I think it was a good place to end this very rich conversation, and turn it over to Jen.
Yes, thank you so much. This has just been such a fascinating conversation. I think when we think of the Bible, we think of something that is static in many cases, and obviously that is not the case. So thank you to Brent, to Jennifer, and to Edgardo for this fantastic conversation.